Welcome to the Aston Barclay podcast. My name is Ben Crawford, and you join me sat here today in sunny Salford with Mark Hammond, founder and managing director of Net Zero Group, and Jos Bennet, carbon consultant for Net Zero Group. Welcome, gents.
Good morning, hello.
Hello.
So we're here today to talk a little bit about the new partnership between iOffset and Aston Barclay. Mark, we'll start with you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your history and how iOffset and Net Zero came about?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So thanks for your time, Ben. Nice to talk to you. The business was founded almost 3 years ago now, and I stepped out of the kind of corporate automotive world. At the time, September 2019, there was forthcoming legislation for a 2040 ban on the sale of new petrol and diesel cars, and that's where I saw the opportunity to work with automotive retailers and OEMs to work towards that target date. Obviously, within, frankly, a matter of months of forming the business, that target came forward to 2035 and then latterly 2030. So that was the origins of the business at the start, and somewhat fortuitous that target's come forward a decade already.
Yeah, it's helping your business kick on a little bit.
Certainly is, yes, yeah.
Yeah, and those targets are something that we talk about quite a lot with our customers because it's something that's very present, and we're certainly seeing the use of, battery electric vehicles. Whilst the volume that we see through auction at the minute is relatively low, our vendors are telling us that, a third of their vehicles, a quarter of their vehicles and more are now new registrations, is that new BEV product and the hybrid product as well.
Yeah, absolutely. From a new vehicle perspective, but looking at the used market in particular, of course, is that the ban in 2030 now, so it's less than 8 years away, is obviously the new car. So the used car product, by definition, is a recycled product.
Yeah.
Obviously, petrol diesel vehicles obviously carry the tailpipe emissions. And I guess what we're trying to do is kind of look at both options, look at the new manufacturing of EVs and the embodied emissions from those vehicles, but equally, actually probably more appropriately, look at the wider market, look at the mass market of consumers that actually can't migrate into an EV for budget and or infrastructure reasons, and how can they be part of this conversation that is on the kind of the news waves on a daily basis? How can they take action and do something progressive, whether that's buying the used vehicle with the emissions in mind, and understanding the consequences of a different make and model, and then subsequently taking actions to then compensate for those unavoidable emissions by driving to work, driving the kids to school, going shopping. What can they do? And that's frankly where the brand iOffset was born, with consumers actually electing to take action and say, yeah, be proud to say iOffset, and I have to at this moment in time drive a petrol diesel vehicle, again, budget or infrastructure reasons or both, but actually I'm doing something progressive and something positive towards the environment by offsetting those unavoidable emissions.
Mm-hmm. Cool. And Jos, carbon consultant, that's a job type I don't think I'd heard before we started working with iOffset. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your history and what your job entails?
Sure, definitely. So I joined Mark last year in that carbon consultant role. It's sort of this new emerging sustainability sector. And what we're doing at Net Zero Group and iOffset is really taking the E from ESG, and there's a C within that E of carbon, understanding carbon intelligence. So I have a master's degree, an MSc from University of Manchester. And Mark brought me on to do, some primary research and analysis of our clients' and partners' data to help them, one, understand where their emissions are as a business or as a person in their lifestyle, to give them the tools to understand that, but also as a business to start to identify hotspot areas and to do that reduction piece, that decarbonisation plan, work within these national and international targets, whether it's the 1.5 Paris agreement or there's IPCC, the sort of scale reports that come out. So I really sit in the middle I haven't got the automotive experience, but I've got this sort of academic background and rigor and experience to sort of apply that to all the analysis and all the sort of commercial work that Mark and the team are doing.
And so this has all come about, and the reason we're sat here today is Aston Barclay's partnership with iOffset. So we were given the challenge that Aston Barclay should become a carbon neutral business, and I think as of right now, that is the case. Aston Barclay is carbon neutral. Do you want to tell us to what degree we're carbon neutral? Because that's not just an easy off-the-cuff statement. In reality, is it?
Yeah, that's right. It's great to work in and partner with Aston Barclay. I think the challenge that we face almost on a daily basis is trying to start the process of what we call the kind of the journey or the pathway to carbon neutrality and then thereafter net zero. So Aston Barclay at this moment in time have measured their baseline carbon emissions, Scope 1 and Scope 2 energy. So that essentially is the emissions generated from running the business, the direct emissions associated from the energy consumption, so electricity, gas, and any company-owned vehicles. So working with the team there, we've measured those emissions, calculated them and converted them into carbon, and then those emissions have then been subsequently offset through international projects that essentially capture or sequester the equivalent amount of carbon out of the atmosphere, which in essence kind of neutralises the emissions from the business and then captures them back out of the atmosphere.
And it's something you hear about quite a lot as as a consumer. When you book a flight, there's now that button there that says offset my flight, and that that seems like a relatively simple thing to do. But I think through the process, one thing that's been really apparent is just measuring your carbon impact is quite difficult, and especially with a business that's large like Aston Barclay that has lots of moving parts, just being able to measure its carbon impact is fairly difficult to do, and that's where iOffset has been really fundamental in helping us do that through your tools.
That's right. So the measuring is, of course, in the old adage, what gets measured gets done. So you have to measure the impact of the business in the first instance. And so what we've done is Scope 1 and 2, which is the baseline energy emissions. Scope 3 is the value chain, and Scope 3 is where 90% of any company's emissions reside. And of course, we're now started on that pathway with Aston Barclay. And one of the key things that you are about to progress with is Category 7 commuting. So actually any organisation is responsible for the emissions of their employees commuting to and from their place of work. What they do outside of that, of course, is not the responsibility of the business, but one of the things that you're looking at doing is measuring the commuting emissions of all staff, then enabling them to also measure their overall lifestyle footprint. And that's the real challenge that we see on a daily basis, despite the media coverage of carbon neutrality, climate action, the kind of climate emergency that's been declared here in the UK. Yet 9 in 10 consumers don't know their own personal carbon footprint. So we see that as a real challenge, yet equal opportunity to enable individuals and start with employees of our partners to measure their personal carbon footprint. Once you've measured it, you can then go on through our platform that you're working with to then commit to reduce that and select from one of 20 pledges that Jos and the team have developed to take small but tangible steps to reduce your footprint, which individually are arguably meaningless, but actually collectively across the employee footprint of Aston Barclay. Imagine if every retailer in the UK, car retailer, had all their team members measuring their carbon footprint and then pledging to reduce it. Just that awareness would be a really meaningful impact.
I have to say, using that tool and seeing those 20 pledges, they're not big things that you're asking people to do. It's not like become a vegan, become an eco warrior overnight. It's give up meat one day a week. And, there's really easy steps to go. And, like you say, if everybody did that simultaneously, that would be a massive impact.
Yeah, and I think Jos will come in a minute as the author of those pledges. But absolutely, that the starting point is it's that the kind of really direct statements around never flying, never eating red meat. It kind of marginalises the mass public, and we're trying to do the opposite of that to engage this challenge, this kind of rallying cry almost, that how can we all collectively do something? And it's not by making people feel bad for the choices they make. It's trying to raise that awareness and then enable individuals to make small manageable changes that again en masse could make a meaningful difference.
Sure, yeah, I think the power of what we're doing with our software Netscope and what it helps a business is that it helps you as a business understand your Scope 1 and 2, so that's your indirect and direct emissions. But then these employee or lifestyle tools really help everyone to live and see with a carbon perspective. We talk about putting on a pair of carbon glasses. You can see the carbon cost of different choices in the supermarket or choices at home, and you realize that actually over time, together as a group or as a company, those add up and they can make a big difference. And I think if we can all live to sort of more understand where the carbon sits, where the hotspots are, where there are easy choices to make to actually reduce, and you can make it fun. You can put it in a team environment where it's kind of competitive to say, it's interesting. You picked that pledge. How are you getting on with it? Have you actually managed to succeed and eat one less day a week? And then actually you can see there's a quantified carbon saving of 300 kilograms associated annually with that pledge. And I think that's really empowering. And that's more than just a business becoming carbon neutral and saying, we offset our Scope 1 and 2. That's creating an organization of change makers. And that, for me, is really exciting.
Yeah, and that's what this entire thing is about. So whilst you're helping Aston Barclay as a company achieve carbon neutrality, the halo effect that has on all of its employees and then thus their families, it's just, I mean, I'm interested in this kind of stuff anyway, and your tool with its 20 pledges, I've been able to show, my friends and family that because I find that really interesting to do, and like we said before, it's them small sequential steps that are just so meaningful in this path towards, reducing the impact of climate change.
Yeah, exactly that, Ben. It's great to hear that you've looked at that and shared it with your friends. The almost the easy option is for, in any organisation, for the CFO or HR director to engage with us, measure the carbon footprint, and then offset it. And that could be kind of a relationship of a direct relationship with no one else in the organisation that achieves the same outcome of being a carbon neutral business, but nobody else is aware. And what Aston Barclay have done is kind of cascade this tool throughout the organisation. As Jos mentioned, there's an element of a little bit of almost competition by filtering it by branch and then by department. So we see who's doing this, and that just really kind of opens up the conversation to the entire organisation as opposed to one soulless individual. And that's really in this message of driving awareness. We talk about action rather than inaction. And again, making it simple. We are ultimately an eco-tech business by definition, and it's a balance of the carbon expertise that Jos and the team of consultants bring, and then managing that through software and through technology to make it quick and clean and easy and engaging for individuals and indeed companies to use. And I think a balance of the two is really compelling. But we need to find that balance of both from a carbon perspective. It's engaging and it's not marginalising consumers and individuals. And then from a tech perspective, again, it hits all those UX channels. It's quick, it's easy, it's efficient, and people will engage in the software.
Yeah, and it has to look great for people to use it.
Exactly, and hence everything that we do is branded. Kind of the colours, the theme, the logos are there, so it feels part of the organisation as opposed to it's something ancillary that's just been added into a conversation.
Mm-hmm. And so part of Aston Barclay's fairly heavy investment into its carbon neutrality is, as you said, being able to offset its impact. Do you want to talk a little bit about, you said earlier how the carbon is sequestered around the world, how that works?
Yeah, sure. So by definition, a carbon offset is a compensation for an equivalent amount of carbon. So 1 carbon credit equals 1 tonne of CO2. The two core types of carbon credit. One is to essentially prevent carbon going to the atmosphere. So that's investing in projects that do exactly that. So renewable energy, so wind, solar, hydro, where you're investing in projects that generate energy from a renewable source as opposed to generating through fossil fuel. So that's kind of energy or carbon prevention. The second is carbon capture, where essentially you are capturing, or the technical term is sequestering the carbon, and that's done through forestry projects or peatland swamp projects. And then by definition, they essentially hold and store that carbon. Again, there's academic arguments both ways in terms of which is the best option. I think on balance, carbon capture, in the sense that it's taking carbon out of the atmosphere, again, as we move towards this kind of Paris target Jos mentioned there. The UN, we have a relationship with the UN based in Bonn, and actually they would argue that it's actually the prevention, because that's the more immediate impact moving towards kind of 2030 and this kind of peak target of emissions and global warming. Most of our partners do go with the carbon capture and the forestry projects on the basis that, again, people understand it, they sense and they understand that forestry and rainforest and investing in these projects that frankly would otherwise be harvested for agriculture or for timber. And what we're seeing and what we saw at the back end of last year in Q4, fueled by COP26 and the media coverage, is that the carbon market, the price of carbon doubled in Q4, which is ultimately a really good thing. In many cases, that's from a low base, but actually, directionally, the price of carbon per tonne by 2030, the UK government and indeed the UN are targeting $100 as a per tonne is the price of carbon. And ultimately, as that price of carbon increases to that, then decisions will be made rather than offset without making infrastructure changes. there'll be a decision made, ultimately, again, at a kind of financial level, and investment level organisations, whether to invest in technology to reduce carbon emissions. So it could be actually renewable energy on site, which is something I know you're looking at as a business as well. Mm-hmm. So, very capital intensive costs up front with kind of a payoff over a number of years. As that price of carbon increases to offset, then actually looking at the options, do I invest in the technology on site, or do we continue to offset? Then actually it won't be as frankly cost effective to offset going forward, which is essentially the direction of travel that we need to go on.
Yeah. And I guess with all these things, either capture or prevention, the joy is that, whilst both are happening, it's all leading to, the best outcome for the planet, isn't it? Ultimately, that's what we're after.
Well, it's all directionally positive. Again, it's back to this overall awareness piece. And whilst what Aston Barclay are measuring their energy emissions, progressing on their Scope 3 reporting, and engaging their employees, that's the driver. It's about individual, collective activity that's starting to make a difference. The ultimate answer, you might have seen in the press, is this long-term carbon capture and storage. There's been some investment by Microsoft to actually generate technology that literally sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. However, it's not commercially viable. It's not on stream. There's some real challenges actually that, agonisingly, that the carbon generated to actually power these machines is what it's actually absorbing. So over time, as that tech does scale, that is the answer longer term. But fundamentally, it's about it's a cultural thing for all of us, kind of global citizens, to be aware of each and every action that we take, every coffee that we buy, do we change our laptop, what car we buy, of course, where we go on holiday, what we eat for dinner tonight, how long we spend in the shower tomorrow morning. All these individual decisions actually kind of mount up to, and ultimately, a carbon cost.
I'm glad you said about the car thing. Let's bring it back to cars then. So, and again, we spoke a lot about education, and so I think part of the work that you do is helping the smaller dealerships understand about how on this journey, about the awareness of climate change, how that can actually be a commercial opportunity for them when it comes to dealing with their consumers. Increasingly the consumer is looking for things that aren't going to damage the planet. And so, whilst the used car dealership may have no intention of selling battery electric vehicles, they can offer products that can offset the carbon impact of that vehicle for the lifetime and that kind of thing. And that's something that you're looking at already, isn't it? It
is, absolutely, Ben. Yeah, so there's probably two elements there that we're helping and working with independent retailers and SMEs outside of automotive to do. One, it's actually measure the carbon footprint. So using our product Netscope that Aston Barclay have engaged with, the baseline carbon footprint can be measured through that product, as opposed to a traditional consulting model, which can be kind of timely and kind of costly indeed. So measuring the footprint is something that we can help all SMEs and particularly independent retailers do. That can be measured, and then once something is measured, you can then track it and ultimately seek to reduce it. The second point then, in terms of again in that value chain of emissions, the product sold, i.e. the car, obviously has a carbon impact in terms of the tailpipe emissions. So yes, absolutely working with independent dealers to then raise awareness of the products that they sell, arguably differentiate their stock. I say arguably on the basis that as every day and week and month passes, this is something that is going to become kind of a cost of doing business, and we are all becoming increasingly aware. So 3 years ago, absolutely was differentiator. Today less so, which ultimately is a good thing because we're all starting to kind of move in this direction. Enabling that independent retailer to provide themselves or indeed their end consumer with a way to readily measure the emissions of that particular vehicle, make an informed choice, and then should they wish to kind of compensate by offsetting those emissions. So obviously you're aware we work with Santander Consumer Finance and Lloyd's Black Horse that are doing exactly the same thing, and using their calculators, individuals and indeed retailers can measure the emissions of a vehicle and again make that informed choice.
Cool. Yeah. And it is a big differentiator, I think. If you've got two cars precisely the same, make, model, trim line, one of them has the green sticker in the corner of the window, it stands out, doesn't it?
Absolutely stands out, and it's again just direction of travel. It's again it's the right thing to do, and ultimately our ambition in terms of this awareness is that the consumer's consideration basket around clearly budgets, make, model, colour, we're working really hard to ensure that the emissions of that vehicle are in that final consideration basket. So actually, I really want a blue car, but actually the red car has got a lower emission, or the emissions are being offset, so I can drive carbon neutral. So I'll compromise and take the red car because it's the right decision environmentally.
Yeah, and so net zero and I offset that you'd count yourself as a startup, I'd say.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah. What's the future look like then for your businesses, for Net Zero Group?
So the future is exciting. We hope as we are progressing. Like I mentioned, it's kind of now being driven by technology as we create calculators and reporting software to enable all of our partners to measure the baseline footprint, engage in the scope 3 value chain, and ultimately reduce their carbon footprint and offset emissions. So using technology, it's becoming easier. Obviously, we're always looking for ways to add value to the carbon calculations and conversions. Something we work really hard on the methodology and expose the methodology of all the conversions and calculations that we undertake. I think that the future is certainly bright. I think we have, of course, kind of this global media attention on us. There's obviously the ban we mentioned on the new sale of petrol diesel vehicles. There's of course the legislation for the UK to be net zero by 2050, and we foresee that the reporting criteria for carbon reporting will be reduced in due course. That therefore will capture more organisations and not just those today that have a turnover of £36 million or £80 million balance sheet. So that threshold will reduce, and that will bring more companies kind of, quite literally, if you pardon the pun, in scope, therefore will be required to measure their carbon footprint. And again, we're seeing it in larger organisations flexing their value chain. Again, not least the government and kind of government contracts whereby to tender, you have to become carbon neutral. So we're seeing that now pick up almost kind of a weekly, monthly basis. Companies come to us needing a carbon footprint for no other reason than to respond to a tender, and that's something that we'll see kind of directionally kind of only progress in one direction.
Well, you said that earlier about the supply chain being one of the biggest impacts to a company's carbon footprint, and it's certainly with some of our customers something that they're now maybe not mandating at this point, but it's certainly coming that companies they work with have to have at the very least a green strategy and green credentials before you can see where the direction of travel is going. It's
a chain of responsibility, and I think scope 1 and 2 is at your house, your indirect and direct emissions, and scope 3 is who you link to, who's that network of organizations, or where you get your products, or where they go after you've used them. And I think with our tool Netscope, and as we expand across these scope 3 categories, and what we're trying to do is get more carbon data into our hands so we can analyze it, and what you can use that data for carbon intelligence then, so you can make commercially viable decisions about where you're going to go, what sort of products you're going to buy, or what sort of services you're going to offer, and can you direct those in a less carbon intensive way, and make smarter decisions, or allow your customers to make smarter decisions. And for us, it's all about getting that data into our hands, and then we can analyze it, convert, and then give that data back to you with some key tips, basically, or some sort of actual commercial advice.
It's interesting what you say, that it's and calling it your own house, because even thinking about Ben Crawford PLC, using your tools, I can judge my own carbon impacts, but then I can nearly achieve my own scope 3 just by really considering the types of food I buy, the car I buy, all that kind of good stuff. I think everybody's on this journey, companies, people, everybody's on this journey together, aren't they? And
I think you've touched on something there, Ben, that's really interesting, and it's what you buy. And I think we are seeing now, almost unanimously, I think, this phrase direction of travel in kind of, the consumer pound. And that consumer pound is being spent with companies that are doing the right thing, and they are kind of measuring their carbon footprint. They are seeking to reduce it. And that is attracting the consumer pound. And I think that is, again, only going to increase, again, as the media coverage progresses. So fast forward to October this year, and COP27 will be here. So this time we're in Egypt, and again, the media coverage will be there. And I am back to the point made at the start. The fact that the majority of UK consumers, 9 out of 10, don't know their own carbon footprint is crazy. So that's something that what we are looking to kind of remedy that, working with partners such as yourself, to really drive that awareness and see actually how can collectively individual consumers actually make informed decisions.
I mean, when I was researching for the 20 pledges we have on Netscope, and you look at eco driving, and you think on average, looking at various data sets, someone can save a ton of carbon a year by, stopping rapid braking and reducing their speed on the motorway. That was kind of eye opening for me. That's real power. We need to get people to know this kind of information. And if you know about that, then you've got these tooltips, you take them home, it starts to cascade across your friends in your network. And actually, I think now we're living in a world where it's cool to be carbon aware. It's cool to be
100%,
to know about sustainability, to sort of know about the newest brands that are doing something different and stopping this kind of damaging status quo, which is bad for the planet, for ecosystems on our doorstep and across the world. And I think what we do here through Offsets, which is working with these international partners, with these really important ecosystems that we need to preserve, with these hotspots of biodiversity, as well as what can we do for our own local communities, whether it's with tree planting or, there's lots of things we can do in the UK as well, and lots of things we need to protect. And I think this is really where, especially focusing on automotive, where there are emissions that they are unavoidable because, not everyone can switch to an EV. It's not an obvious option. So we need to give people the tools to do other things, and it needs to be across this kind of end to end. It's actually really, it's kind of exciting because there's so much potential there.
And it feels like low hanging fruit because the impact is so great on automotive. Like that automotive has on the planet. Actually, just changing your behaviour around not braking quite as hard and doing 65 rather than 70 in a motorway. The impact is pretty big, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think we talking about the direction of travel for us is we want to get more data about that. So we want to know if you have actually done that, and then tell you exactly how much carbon you saved and how much money you saved on petrol as well. And I think this is where it starts to get really interesting because those two are so combined that we can actually give you more income to spend on cool, sustainable brands, and also you can cut your carbon footprint. And I think it's those two things are going to become more combined as carbon taxes come in, and it becomes harder and harder to do these quote unquote dirtier carbon intensive activities. And we're trying to be ahead of the curve here, I think.
Well, that takes us to the bottom of the podcast. Thank you, Mark and Jos, for taking the time to talk to us today, and thank you to you, the listener, for joining us. If you want to find more about iOffset, just visit ioffset.io, or you can contact Mark through LinkedIn at iOffset. You can get in touch with me at podcast@astonbarclay.net, and if you want to follow us on LinkedIn, it's at Aston Barclay Group. I've been Ben Crawford. You've been listening to the Aston Barclay podcast. See you next time.